welcome to this event at the Center for South Asia at Stanford. I'm so delighted to welcome you to our conversation on Hinduism, politics, and the nation with Rohit Chopra, Thomas Blom Hansen, and Dheepa Sundaram. We are really grateful for everybody for participating in this, and we hope it'll be a rich conversation. You will be able to ask questions after the panelists have all had a chance to talk. So please start thinking of them as we go, and we can make this a fantastic discussion. So I'm Anna Bigelow. I'm faculty in religious studies here at Stanford University, and I am also the director of the Center for South Asia. I'd also like to thank Lalita Duperon and also Simrat Maturu for all of their help in putting this together. So thank you so much. We'll begin with our land acknowledgement that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Oh, great. So let's begin our conversation on this timely subject with our neighbor up, down the road, sideways. I'm not sure which direction exactly, north, south, east, west. The peninsula is a weird place that destroys all of our orientations. But Rohit Chopra is associate professor in the Department of Communication at Santa Clara University. And his work centers on global media and cultural identity, new media, the politics and poetics of global music, and disability in media. He's the author of, among many publications, The Gita for a Global World, Ethical Action in an Age of Flux, The Virtual Hindu Nation, Saffron Nationalism and New Media, also Virtual Hindu Rashtra, and Technology and Nationalism in India, Cultural Negotiations from Colonialism to Cyberspace from 2008. You can find all of his works at rohitchopra.info. We can put that in the chat for those of you who want to learn more. And so Rohit will have a chance to share some of his thoughts with us, and then we will shift gears afterwards. So welcome, Rohit.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to the center. Thanks, Anna, Lalita, Simrat. It's just lovely to be here, and thanks to everyone for making the time this evening. So I'll just go ahead and have a presentation. My presentation will basically be broad brush strokes. I'll just share a few observations, and I'll make sure I keep to time. So let me just put my stopwatch on. All right, so I'm just going to start this and share the screen in a second. So yeah, my talk is titled, or presentation is under the broad umbrella of Hinduism, politics, and the nation. I'll be talking about what I call socially mediated visions of the Hindu nation in the Modi era. And today, let's just go to 2022. I don't think it's inaccurate to say that at this moment, Hindu nationalism or Hindutva has become the dominant ideology of present-day India. Perhaps starting gradually with events since 2014 when Modi was elected prime minister. But of course, there's a longer history to it as well. And just to sort of very quickly go over the definition of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, it's the claim that India, which is constitutionally a secular republic, is fundamentally a Hindu country. And Hindus are the true authentic citizens of the Hindu nation, and minorities, especially Muslims and Christians, are outsiders. And there's this division between sort of Indic peoples, Indic religions, which include Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, and other religions. And this resurgence of Hindutva, or this as a kind of commonsensical definition of Indian identity, in some ways parallels the history of Modi. One can talk a lot about him, but the long and short of it is in 2002, in the wake of an anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat, when Modi was the chief minister, and he is supposed to have actively encouraged or passively let it happen, he was persona non grata, denied a visa to the US. And this is India Today, which is a very interesting publication in the sense that it's kind of a bellwether. It's completely pro-establishment. So and this was the sort of message in every single magazine, on the cover of every single magazine. So from hero of hatred in 2002, I think this was 2014, he's the game changer. And then, you just have this whole kind of hagiographic apparatus, this book, which borrowing the language of Silicon Valley, which is a story in itself, creative disruptor, the maker of new India. So it's been this collective act of amnesia or setting aside that history of violence. Let me just very quickly mention a couple of things about the Hindu right and the internet, which is the area I've been working on for many years. And you see internet-based Hindu nationalism starting in the mid-90s in India, in the post-liberalization or post-economic reform economy, which was, ironically ushered in by Congress leaders. And from this very early point onwards, 1990s when the World Wide Web is invented, it's the first killer app to do with the internet. And by the mid-90s, you have the first, Indian websites. I worked for rediff.com, which was India's first portal in the late 90s. And from that sort of moment of origin, the internet was a very important space for the Hindu right. And it was a battleground where the so-called secular media could be challenged. Diasporic Indians, and a lot of them in Silicon Valley, were a key constituency of support for the Hindu right. And many Hindu nationalist websites, and by one count, there were some 500 of them that were actually hosted on servers in Silicon Valley. They sought to create this counter narrative of Hindu history against what they call leftist propaganda of the Congress. And they wanted to challenge what they called the pseudo-secularism of the Nehruvian model of the Congress, of independent India, which in their view appeased minorities. They wanted to replace this with true secularism. Now, starting with the run up to 2014, I want to say about 2011, 2012 onwards, the Hindu right makes very effective use of the internet and social media, and it wants to displace the UPA government, which was held by the Congress with Dr. Manmohan Singh as the prime minister. And they sort of create this culture of abuse, trolling, and intimidation. And it's just systematically escalated since then. And what is happening online, there's a deep connection with what's happening offline. In fact, instead of thinking of them as a dichotomy, one can think of them as contiguous. So literally from the moment Modi became prime minister, any Hindu right group or any group of people who just called themselves a Hindu organization, they started attacking minorities. You had Muslims lynched on allegations of cow slaughter, Dalits assaulted, and so on. So now I want to relate this back to essentially the broad topic of this conversation about Hinduism, politics, and the nation. And I want to focus on two ideas of the nation. Two ideas in the two shifts in the idea of the Hindu nation or Hindu Rashtra. So what kind of Hindu Rashtra can we see and what's going on online, but also sort of offline? So one thing that's happened is that the discourse of pseudo-secularism, right, which versus true secularism has been reframed in a particular way. And the online debate now among the Hindu right is quite fascinatingly between these two factions. And Op India, which is, I don't know, the sort of tell-quell of the Hindu right, actually it's a third-rate rag, but it has this really interesting article about these two factions. There's one group which is called the Vikas or Progress faction, and they are also termed Raitas. And there's, the Hindu right sense of humor is sort of very low quality, very low brow. The weird etymology of that term is, from yogurt-based preparation called Raita, and Raita Felana, spreading Raita means making a mess. So one faction of the Hindu right online calls these people Raitas because it says you're messing up Hinduism. And the Raitas, they say that it is a Hindu state that will deliver true equality, secularism, true feminism. And they, are fine with beef eating as well. So India must have these values, but under the sort of structure of a Hindu state. And the other faction is what are called the Trads, which insists that India should not be a liberal society, but an ideal Hindu one, which in their mind, is patriarchal, has, it follows the principles of caste hierarchy and so on. The second point, and I can go into more depth in the question answer session, the second shift in the idea of the nation relates to a kind of spectacular violence, or this violence that's against minorities that circulates on social media. So it's pretty comprehensively documented that there's been a rise in attacks on minorities since 2014. And actually, I think this one paper, Hindustan Times, that had a hate tracker, Samar Halankar is the name of this wonderful journalist who was running it. And I think it was actually shut down under pressure from the government. Social media has been complicit in this violence. WhatsApp has been used to spread rumors that have sparked religious riots, led to the lynchings of Muslims. And this form of violence, it's a kind of pornographic violence. You have these clips which show minorities being assaulted or lynched in the name of the nation, and these circulate very widely on social media. And it's not unsurprising that Modi follows a lot of really terrible, vile trolls on Twitter and Facebook who routinely issue rape and death threats, and it's got significant international attention. Now, sort of moving towards the end, this spectacular violence, I want to refer to a remarkable essay by Thomas. Actually, I was just mentioning, talking about about the essay with him the other day, that it's really been very helpful in helping me think through a few things, but I'm still working this out. It's an essay called The Political Theology of Violence in India. And the argument in it is that violence in India is seen as related, it's an event, and it's delinked from actors. So it's beyond agency. It's always described as spontaneous. It's attributed to criminality or, badmashi or gundagardi, which means thuggishness, a mob mentality. It's always some other force. And there's a fascinating bit. Thomas was in Bombay in '93 when there were Hindu-Muslim riots and anti-Muslim riots, the second round. I was in Bombay then too, coincidentally. And he talks about having a conversation with Shiv Sainiks who participated in the violence, and their eyes wouldn't meet his. So it was always as if this came from somewhere else. So they often express signs of embarrassment or seek to displace the cause of violence. Now, moving towards the end, since 2014, there's been an unapologetic celebration among those who circulate videos on social media, and that's mirrored on the ground, and they sort of cross-pollinate. And the horrible events today or yesterday of these videos of people snatching hijabs of female Muslim students is just one of many examples of that. So in conclusion, I have two sets of thoughts, and this is open-ended, so I'd be very interested in your comments, critique. One thing that's happened is that the debate about tradition and modernity has been subsumed within an overarching Hindu nationalist idea of India, at least on social media. So the debate now is not about secular modernity versus religion or secular modernity versus Hinduism, but it's about Hindu modernity and Hindu tradition. And the terms of the debate on Indian identity have been set by the Hindu right. And this has happened sort of online and offline. When Arvind Kejriwal wants to demonstrate he's a good Hindu, when Rahul Gandhi says that he's a Shiv Bhakt, that the terms of the discourse have shifted. And for me, a question is, how has the political theology of violence been reframed in relation to the new Hindu nation? And a question I'm thinking of is, are we moving, or have we moved from a logic of violence as inevitability to a logic of violence as necessity? So I think I'll just end there. And I think it's a frightening moment for India. So I just wanted to end with this sort of image of Modi's kind of a popinjay. He's very vain, and for someone who's a Hindu nationalist, he loves he loves Italian clothes. So I always say that Hindu nationalists are influenced by different Italians. That I think Savarkar was influenced by Mazzini and Golwalkar by Mussolini, and Modi's influenced by Gucci and Bulgari is my theory. And this quote from a marvelous Yeats poem, The Second Coming, is something that strikes me, that what rough beast, its hour come around at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohit. That gives us a lot to chew on as we get going here today. So thank you. And now I would like to welcome into the conversation my esteemed colleague and the founding director of the Center for South Asia, Thomas Blom Hansen, is the Reliance-Dhirubhai Ambani Professor of Anthropology at Stanford. He's anthropologist of political life, ethno-religious identities, violence, and urban life in South Asia and Southern Africa. His books include The Saffron Wave, Democracy and Hindu Nationalism in Modern India, which explores the larger phenomenon of Hindu nationalism in the light of the dynamics of India's democratic experience and wages of violence, Naming and Identity in Post-Colonial Bombay, which explores historical processes and identity formations that gave rise to violence, socio-religious conflict, and the renaming of the city in 1995. His most recent book is The Law of Force, The Violent Heart of Indian Politics, which was published in 2021, and also this edited book on the majoritarian state, along with Angana Chatterjee and Christophe Jafferlo. So I am delighted to welcome my esteemed colleague, Thomas.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. I apologize, I don't have any slides, and I will not really, although I've just published a book on violence in Indian politics, I won't really talk about that today. Instead, I want to sort of build off from what Rohit was just saying here, and to make 2 points about what the sort of social media and the sort of internet-mediated presence of Hindutva has meant for the way in which both the Hindutva forces, but also many other people who are not necessarily active supporters of the BJP, not even voters perhaps, the way in which, and maybe just sort of barely political at all, the way in which this has played out in representations of what it is to be Hindu and what Hinduism means in relation to India. So I speak as someone who's been traveling to, living in, working on India for more than 2 decades. And for me, it's very striking that there's been a real shift in terms of the way one is received among not so much ordinary people on the ground, but more intellectuals, officials, and so on and so forth. And this has gone from being a sort of experience of openness and curiosity, and even thankfulness for writing and taking an interest in India, to a attitude of suspicion, but also of being prepared to be, as it were, hurt and being offended. So that's a very ubiquitous, and this is more pronounced among the sort of more educated sections than it is among ordinary people on the ground. And I think the way to understand it, why did this happen? Well, one of the things is that Hinduism as a unit as something that's identical with India, as Rohit was saying, and that's at the heart of what India is or should be, that this has been produced successfully. And I want to just say, draw your attention to the role that the Vishwa Hindu Parishad has actually played in this. I remember early on in my work, and I think in 1990 or 89 or something, I met with members of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, both in India, but also in various parts of Europe. And what they were saying at this time was that, look, we have had a great deal of success becoming this kind of umbrella organization for all kinds of Hindus. They can all find a home. We are all for Hindu unity. And at that time, they were like, you know, what has happened, what the VHP has been able to do in Kenya, in the UK, and increasingly in the US and elsewhere, with significant Indian populations of Indian origin, we want to do that in India. And what you can see now, the result is not, of course, all Vishwa Hindu Parishad, but there is a way in which the representations of that by organizations that explain, that are sort of pedagogical tools that explain to interested people what may it mean to be, what does Hinduism mean, what's the history of Hinduism, and so on and so forth, is on the internet enormously dominated by websites and various sort of outlets that propagate a version of it that is very close to the sort of Hindutva narrative that Rohit talked about. Now, one of the things that we know, the story, the larger story of this, right? The attacks on Wendy Doniger, on Sheldon Pollock, who has edited, the Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock, who has edited many volumes of text, of classical texts from India. And I think all of this is an expression of a certain kind of aspiration to what I would call cultural sovereignty, right? That the idea that that Hinduism is an object that is unified, that has a character, is a kind of diaspora version of Hinduism that's sort of coming home to India, as it were, as this sort of umbrella identity within which one can find a home. And that is an entity that we own. You are not allowed to interfere with that. You are not allowed to even raise questions. You cannot, if you're not a Hindu, you have no business discussing this or even researching it. And I think this is a project that's been going on for quite some time, and it has lots of supporters. And what makes it cohere is the language of Hinduism as a civilization, which is very powerful and very logical to lots of people, and also has lots of deep resonances in scholarship and older scholarship too. And the civilization, the idea of civilization being the entity that defines what India is, gives a kind of historical legitimacy to the Hindutva project. And I think it's remarkable the way in which that argument has been actually prosecuted and made and has succeeded. And but on the other hand, we shouldn't be too surprised, because if you look at lots of the writings also of nationalists and sort of mainstream intellectuals in the 20th century about India and the Hindu basis of what India is, and the language of civilization is also there. So when it's articulated by people who belong or who are aligned with the Hindutva vision of India's future, they're saying something that's already familiar to lots of people. And therein, it's a tweak. It's a sort of discursive tweak of a great story that was already told. And I think this is something that is worth thinking about. One of the things, and I want to say the second point I want to make, is something that became very clear, I think, to most of us who were involved. So, as you may know, we were involved in an argument about the writing of Indian history and the representation of Indian history in California textbooks. And this was something that took place some years ago. And it happens to be a process that the California Education Department has set in motion that establishes hearings where community groups can come and make representations about how various countries and ethnicities are represented in the California textbooks. What we've seen is that the Hindu-American Foundation very effectively has adopted a language of minority. Again, it's sort of the diasporic model of overall Hindu representation as a Hindu unity, Hinduism as one thing, that's being presented again. And this was presented to this commission that deals with history or sort of vets and discusses the content of history books written in California, which are copied in much of the rest of the country. And it was done by one of their sort of most effective things was a campaign against caste being discussed as an issue in India. And one of their weapons was to present and mobilize school children, high school children, who would come and give testimony in front of the commission, saying and witnessing or saying that we are being abused and we are being ridiculed by our friends because they're saying, oh, so Indians are terrible people and this is what you do with the caste system. So it's really hurtful to us and our sentiments to even be taught this thing. So it feeds into this sort of larger issue around the sort of cultural sovereignty, which is, when you look at what the Hindutva project began as, that it was actually an argument about that. It's an argument about not necessarily capturing state power as it happened, but it's an argument about making the Hindu nation sovereign in a cultural, emotional, and social sense before perhaps even to capturing state power. So that's the project that's still going on. And so I just want to end on that note to say that what we see in the diaspora, as it were, is in some ways pioneering some of the techniques that are then brought back to India. The specific form of language of hurt, the idea of the majority having these kinds of, or experiencing these forms of abuse as a majority, and so on and so forth. That whole model of emotional sort of exploitation, emotional hurt, collective hurt has been one of the very effective ways of campaigning. So I just want to end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, I think this is a phenomenon we're seeing in many fora, not just in relation to India, and something that is very important for us to be alert to. So thank you. Our last speaker and also moderator for our ongoing conversation is Dheepa Sundaram, who is an assistant professor of Hindu studies, critical theory, and digital religion at the University of Denver. Welcome to all of our students. Her research examines the formation of Hindu virtual religious publics, online platforms, social media, apps, and emerging technologies such as virtual reality and artificial intelligence. Her current book project examines how commercial ritual websites fashion a new digital canon for Hindu religious praxis, effectively branding religious identities through a neoliberal Vedicizing of virtual spaces. Her most recent article explores how Instagram helps foster virtual ethno-nationalist social networks within India, highlighting issues of accessibility to religious spaces, and the viability and visibility of online counter-narratives, especially those from minoritized and marginalized caste, gender, and class communities. So we are really delighted to welcome our friend from the Rockies, Dheepa.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I just want to say not only thanks to both Lalita and Anna, but also to Rohit and Thomas for just doing an excellent job, I think, laying out two different aspects, both the affective and sort of the instrumental aspects of Hindutva in terms of not only how it's functioned, but also how it's moving forward. I don't want to say too much, but what I'd like to do is sort of highlight what I think would be nice for us to start our discussion. And sort of, I think the best way for me to go about this is to sort of start with Rohit and then end with Thomas, if that's okay. But the two things that really stood out to me, and I'd love to really think more about in our conversation, is this idea of secularism. As a semiotician, you know, that particular term in an article I'm working on right now has really become quite charged. And I think this really connects with Thomas's last point about the emotional character, right, of how Hindutva draws people together. And some of the things that I look at in particular in relation to the term secular, I would love for us to think more about in the context of political theology. And that's namely, the term secular has appeared particularly in social media spaces like Facebook groups, which are a very interesting phenomenon because they're both isolated but also networked. And they are networked for financial and capital movement rather than networked for people to connect. But what's interesting about this term is that it almost creates identity blocks, and people identify with how one describes themselves as a secular, either a true secular, as Rohit pointed out, or a pseudo-secular, and sort of this other term that he didn't mention, but I know I've talked about, which is secular, right? Like this idea that you could be someone who is literally against what true secular would mean. And what's interesting about this is that we see almost a exchange between what's happening in those spaces and what's happening in material policy development in India. And so that really brings me to what I really enjoyed about Thomas's comments, but particularly thinking about the democratic state and violence and this sort of affective quality of Hindutva. This isn't, you know, typically when we talk about movements of like ethno-fascism in particular, but we also, we think about how they're functioning, we think about them being very divisive, and that is true, but Hindutva is actually predicated in a lot of ways about building a certain kind of affective community. And I think Thomas really hit the nail on the head there, right? And that affective community ties very well with the internet strategy that Rohit brought out, because that is where people end up making connections that seem very material and real. I'm not suggesting they're not real, but they feel real, right? And they sort of create networks between groups that we wouldn't have necessarily seen before through the language that Rohit brought out. And so this brings me to sort of a couple of questions that I'd like to open up with, but I'm sure that actually they have a lot to say, and our audience, I'm hoping, will also please put some questions into the chat. But I have a couple that I'd like to start out with, and I'm not particular in terms of how we address them, but I was also really struck by the idea of political theology and Thomas's point about the event. This is something that I think is really a great place for us to start. Political theology of violence, what do we mean by that? Because the term political theology itself, sort of has its own critical history, right? And I'm really curious to think about what that would mean for the sort of affective community building that Hindutva likes to engage in. People feel very much included in those spaces, and they feel like they're part of something broader, much like any nationalist movement. But when we think about it being through a theology of violence, there's this idea that it's riveting the community. And so I'm curious if we could talk more about what that actually means. And coming out of that, I'm wondering if we can also talk about how we can understand Hindu modernity in the context of this battle over on the concept of secular, right? What does a secular democracy, and those two terms being sort of signifiers in the space that maybe have multiple meanings, mean? What does that modernity look like? And then one final question, something that I've been thinking a lot about, and both of you, I think, give me a lot to think about. My current article project is on something I'm calling Hindutva futurism, where we see Hindutva groups quite often appropriate the language of social justice frameworks, as well as movements to center marginalized communities like decoloniality. Those words and terms seem to appear in a ideology and in spaces that don't actually adhere to the sort of intellectual history of where those terms have come from. And in particular, we are seeing in the United States, Hindutva-leaning organizations co-opting anti-racist frameworks, for example, to promote illiberal and, in many cases, discriminatory and biased, let's be honest, casteist, right, frameworks for sort of protecting what they're calling the sort of maligned Hindu majority or minority, excuse me. And I think this plays into the, again, affect comments on affect and sort of emotion that Thomas made. But I'm really curious, I just lost my question here specifically. Can we see this push to consider the relationship between modernity, nationalism, and what I want to maybe call the sort of anxiety of Hindutva, this emotional anxiety of community, as a sort of futurism? And what would it mean to consider Hindutva through a lens that appropriates these terms for liberatory frameworks? So I'll end there and throw those questions out, sort of just get us started.
Should I just go first, or
Nope, feel free. Jump in.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep it short. I'm going to punt on the question of political theology because I'll leave that to Thomas. I'll just very briefly speak to the point about the secular. And again, Dheepa, this may not be a sort of adequate response. It's just more like something that comes to mind. What is very interesting to me is that the discussion about secularism in its different variants, pseudo-secularism, but also secularism, and indeed the use of the term has now been taken over completely by the right almost, at least in public space. So, all the usual suspects who would talk about secularism, every time there was, a religious conflict in India, every time there were riots, after the destruction of the Babri Masjid, there was this idea that, our secularism has been violated, right? You even have, Vajpayee, who was, of course, played a role in the demolition of the Babri Masjid, expressing some regret. So the idea that, even if you disagreed with the fact that Indira Gandhi introduced the word secular at a particular point of time, 76, and got it into the constitution, there was more legitimacy to the idea that this secularism is there in our soil. It's sort of permanent. And now what I find is that these, if you look at the journalists who might call themselves liberal, or people who claim to stand for liberal values, even the Congress, they have abandoned the word secular. So in that political conversation, it's vanished, and suddenly it sort of comes up in these, these online spaces which are right only. And you still find it used in some of, left progressive spaces, but those spaces, just in terms of, number, they're just so small compared to, just the vast kind of range of Hindu nationalist groups. And of course, the other thing I should just very quickly point out is, 20 years ago when I started seeing this phenomenon, I actually saw these Hindu nationalists online, and I was fascinated by them and thought it might be a good thing to study. It was perhaps okay to make a generalization about Hindu nationalism online as one thing. But now, for instance, your work on globalizing dharma, you realize that within that online world itself, there's so much variation. So within the universe of Hindu nationalism at large, there's a lot going on, but there is a distinct subset of it that is very interested in investigating secularism. And if earlier it was easy to mock or dismiss their jokes, their point as a joke, I think now it's not. These arguments have real power. And then the second point was about Hindu modernity. Now, I'll just say that the question of Hindu modernity takes a different shape in different terrains. One terrain, which I know a little better than the others, is the terrain of science and technology. And to me, that's interesting that that's been a constant since the 19th century at least. And that's what Gyan Prakash's lovely book, Another Reason, is about, that, you accepted that the West was superior. So there was this anxiety to show that there was something called Hindu science, which was at par with Western science. And both were perhaps part of, some universal imperative. And there's an interesting genealogy that can be traced to the fact that, science and technology gives you a certain kind of authority to speak as a person who has a modern sensibility. And that's one reason why someone who's an engineer or a scientist can become an expert on Indian history and Hindu religion overnight. But, if you are a professor of the humanities, and you teach the humanities, you're a sort of elite Macaulayite secularist. So that contradiction, I think, is explained precisely by the claim that, it is science that gives you access to that modernity. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, let me just jump in here with just a few brief comments, and I want to make sure we have time for other questions. Just on the political theology, since I was the author of that article, it's a term that was brought into the world by a right-wing jurist and intellectual, German, Carl Schmitt, in the context of his writings about sovereignty. And by political theology, he means the idea of the sovereign decision as a form of miracle, that by which he means it's inscrutable, and it is also radically contingent, and it is a decision. And he says that is the analogy. It is something that's outside the normal flow of politics. It's outside the normal flow of social life. It stands above, which is where he thinks the sovereign should be. And he joined the Nazi party and embraced the idea of the Führer principle and so on and so forth. Now, I use it in this article as standing in for the idea of violence being something, an event that exactly stands outside also of everyday life. That's sort of a construction that also almost absolves even the perpetrators of responsibility. In that article, I also take the example of the use of fire, the use of burning people's houses, burning people as an agency that has no substance, right? As something that's a displaced agency. And therefore you can say, well, the fire happened. I don't know. We burned that building and they died. but it wasn't us, it was the fire that did it. And so it's a metaphor, of course, of a certain kind of anger, but it's an anger that was not completely owned. And when I discussed it with Rohit a few days ago, what he said, and I want to repeat that point, is that kind of maybe evading or not taking responsibility for violence has changed. In fact, now there is a lot of people, and we see them online again, right? I mean, they're happily making videos of themselves and their pursuits, trying to own and trying to take credit for all these various kinds of extreme violent events. So that's the context of it. I still think there is an idea of violence being an agent that can do something, that can create transformation. And I think many supporters of Hindu nationalism have a deep fascination with violence, and a deep fascination. Those of us who have lived through or been through riots in India will also know that there is a kind of tacit approval of a lot of it from lots of people who are the sort of bystanders, as it were. So it's not as if it's a repulsion of violence, it's actually a sort of tacit enjoyment of it, something that I think we have to recognize. So I just want to, but I do think, just to come to Deepa's other point about emotion, yes, I think what is the whole Hindutva project was built from the beginning on the mobilization of certain kind of sentiment, certain kind of emotion. And that's what they run on. And that's their strong suit. And they're able to provide a kind of emotional home for people in the diaspora, but they're also able to provide an emotional home for people in India who feel that the world is a little bit out of kilter, or that they're not getting recognized in the way they should, or whatever. So voting for or supporting, forget about voting, but just supporting the sentiment that is Hindutva does some work. And it does that work, which is to provide a certain kind of center of your own world. It's a form of game of recognition, you can say, that it recognizes you. I'm a Hindu. I belong to this group, and we are strong, and we are violent, and be afraid of us, right? And that is maybe I'm not violent, but other people are, right? And that's the attraction of it for people who otherwise feel perhaps disempowered.
Thank you both. That was really interesting. One point I will say, and I think we'll get to our first question here. Both of you just sort of, I think hinted at something that I think is really interesting when we look at the online sort of the growth of the online global sort of transnational networks of Hindutva, in part is really thinking about how that violence has become much more explicit, like you mentioned, Rohit. But also it's not just violence in India, right? Like one of the things that I've seen is like a lot of what I call hate solidarities, right? Like you're seeing people who wouldn't agree sort of reveling in a sort of shared space of exclusion and creating community through exclusion, which I think is really interesting, like Hindu nationalists commenting on white nationalists and sort of, seeing that kind of community like in a very strange way come out. Lots to talk about here, but I'd love to get to our first question.
So my question is about the sense of community that you guys have been talking about, where Hindutva provides a sense of community, strength, and belonging to people both within India and in the diaspora. And I'm wondering who is included and who is excluded from this community. I think violence against Dalits were mentioned, but if I understand correctly, Dalits are Hindus themselves as well. And so obviously, Christians and Muslims are not included in Hindutva, but within the Hindutva framework, who reaps the benefits of this strong community and who is excluded out of the Hindu population?
Thomas or Rohit, would you care to respond?
Well, okay, just very quickly, there's a discourse of inclusion as well, right? So on the one hand, there's this idea that everyone in India is a Hindu. Hinduism is a way of life. It's more fundamental than religion. So even Muslims are Hindus. Their ancestors were Hindus and so on. The question for me always becomes like, on what terms is that inclusion and community taking place? And so there is, Modi is popular among elites, but he's also popular among subaltern groups. And just recently, a person, Professor Dr. J.S. Bandukwala, he passed away. He was someone whose house was, I think, burned down in the 2002 riots. And he mentioned that the people who committed that violence as part of these Hindu mobs were Dalits. So on the one hand, that violence becomes a way of creating community, but then, the structure of the Hindu right ultimately is very casteist. And at that Dismantling Global Hindutva conference that we had, there was Bhanwar Meghanshi, who is a Dalit, and he spoke about how he was part of the RSS, but the sort of road for him to progress was cut off. I mean, there was just no way he could ever really fully belong, right? He would never be sort of authentically Hindu. So it's the same thing with, Muslims, that as a Muslim who's within that, who accepts sort of the sovereignty of this Hindu idea, or this model of Hindu sovereignty, or the superiority of Hindus, must constantly keep proving, right, that I'm a Muslim who, like APJ Kalam, I play the Veena, I know the Vedas, and so on. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I just want to support that. I mean, of course, it's the obvious outsiders are the Muslims and the Christians, but the really I think you put your finger on it. The really interesting question is the question of caste. So how does caste figure in this sort of larger Hindutva configuration? And there's a couple of ways, right? I mean, on one hand, there is an acknowledgement that this is something, and there's been a very effective mobilization by various Hindu nationalist outfits of both Dalits, but also tribal groups and so on. Promising them inclusion of various kinds, promising them, education. And here the RSS really has a leg up in the competition, because they have these people who are willing to move out and live in remote communities and be school teachers and propagate this particular, it's a kind of missionizing effort. And no other political formation or outfit in India has that kind of will to do this, or capacity to do this. So that's one dimension. It's been explored by various people. The other thing is that Dalits, there is a great deal of, I work in Maharashtra, Western India, which is sort of the home to a historically very strong Dalit movement. And the same thing as what Rohit was saying, many Dalits may have been attracted to Hindu nationalism, but then found that they couldn't progress. But then they have found a home in Shiv Sena, which is a local grown Hindu chauvinist organization that has actually been remarkably effective at promoting and letting Dalits also rise high up in the party. And today, Shiv Sena is one of the strongest proponents of celebrating Dr. Ambedkar and promoting scholarships and other schemes for Dalits and so on. So these things are utterly compatible. Because it's informed by this civilizational idea that Dalits are part of this. Okay, they may be Buddhists, but and they may not want to be Hindus, but they're still part of us, as it were, right? Whereas those other people who have opted for those foreign ideologies are, that's a different matter, right? And that's really where the fault line is.
Yeah, I think I'll add one thing. In my own research, looking at Hindu ritual websites, for example, you learn a lot by which gods and which communities are hailed by those websites. So I tell people all the time, like, if you want to worship, if you're a worshiper of Tara at Tara Pit, you're going to have to go to their own website, because that is not going to appear on any of the Hindu cultural websites. So there's a digital repository of what constitutes sort of global Hinduism that is also dovetails with the Hindu Rights Project. Do we have another question?
Thanks so much for a great panel. And I'm really enjoying not enjoying, but appreciate the turn to the question of affect. And so staying with that, maybe I can turn on my video. Hi, everyone. So I wanted to kind of dwell on the question of caste, and there seems to be a kind of robust online pushback to Hindutva, not from the liberal progressive left, which kind of sometimes still turns to the category of the secular and is then quickly pushed away as secular, but from young Dalit activists and Dalit Bahujan Adivasi. There are new kind of really interesting formations that are, go now. It's strong enough to have the acronym DBA. And even at the Dismantling Hindutva conference, the most kind of powerful voices, and if we want to turn to that category of hope as a radical category and not just a liberal kind of empty category, it's coming from these groups. So I totally hear you, Thomas, on the turning to the Shiv Sena, but there are also other kinds of formations around young DBA online groups. And so that was one question. And the other question was around gender. I mean, we've had these discussions around how the sentiment of hurt is also being mobilized around a certain configuration of machismo and pushing back against earlier kind of figurations of the Brahmin as effeminate, etc. Right? So, and that has to do with anti-colonial kind of movements that were also mobilized around the affect of hurt. So I wanted to kind of use this time to my question is mainly about these kind of other groups that are pushing back. Thanks.
That's a great question. I'm personally very interested, so I'd love to hear whoever would like. Maybe we can have Thomas weigh in first and then have Rohit.
Yeah, no, I just want to say again, I mean, refer to just a small example of that. This is actually quite some time ago, before many of the Dalit groups became as well organized and vocal as they are now. But even in that, those hearings where the, what kind of Indian history is going to be taught in the US, right? There were two groups in addition to the academics, and that was people from the Sikh community in California and Dalits, right? And they were very extremely good and extremely articulate. I think that has only grown more and more. I do think it's very interesting what you're saying, that and I think it speaks to a larger shift also in Indian politics and Indian political sentiment, that many of the older sort of liberal left arguments about secularism come up, but then they're quickly dismissed, maybe also because secularism in India was a slogan, but on the ground, it actually didn't really mean anything more substantive than a certain kind of even-handedness, right? A certain kind of fair-mindedness, a certain, that was enough, that you could be called secular if you could be deeply religious and yet a secular person by your conduct. And that's actually what secular meant in practice. And that, I think, is why that has been easy to push away, because there wasn't, the project itself didn't have a deeper, I think, foundation. And but it's actually now, it's the Dalits and the OBCs and that kind of politics that really is the challenge to the Hindutva project more than anything else. But again, the traditional liberal left doesn't have, I think, that alignment between those two different sentiments, right, have not happened. And I see it as a problem probably on the Indian left to actually read the signs and the tea leaves properly and see what's going on right in front of us, and see what kind of new alliances might be built.
Okay. Thanks, Usha. It's a fantastic question, and I agree. And to me, there's some really interesting indicators. One, so Gail Omvit, who passed away recently, I remember she wrote a piece in the EPW, or it was another journal, 1998, and she said cyberspace is Brahminical. And I actually remember that statement. It's quite fascinating. And then in the 90s, you did get this sort of discourse of, there were these very interesting websites, which in some ways the discourse of the Hindu nationalist websites and the Dalit websites mirrored each other. Both of them would claim that they had been victims of a genocide and Holocaust. Both of them would, claim indigeneity, that we are the sort of original peoples and so on. From there now you have, I think, a much more robust presence online, whether it's the Ambedkar Study Circle and so on. To me, there's two very interesting things that have happened. One is, the introduction of the term Savarna. Now, when I grew up in India, I never heard that term. But what that term does is it sort of provincializes, caste Hindus as the sort of invisible norm. And secondly, that, you have a kind of you have a kind of logic of political argument, which is critical not just of the Hindu right, but is also critical of, there were some really strong critiques on Twitter from some of these groups of the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference. And I think what they were critiquing is what Mukul Kesavan has described among the Indian left or elite left or whatever you want to call it as behalfism, right? That you always speak on behalf, and they're rejecting this behalfism. And I think one of the problems with that old left is that they sort of dismiss the fundamental place of caste as, identity politics, right? And identity politics is divisive. And I think that doesn't get them anywhere. And to me, what's also in some ways, it poses a challenge, but it's also heartening, is that these groups are unapologetic about their positions and they're not willing to reframe them into that old discourse of secularism. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, no, I think those are really great answers. I would say one other thing that I would add is that we're seeing very interesting kind of coalitions emerge, particularly, I think, because we're seeing the Hindu right not only capitalize on so-called indigenous peoples in various ways, and I mean capitalize quite literally, right? We're seeing both the exploitation of Adivasi lands, but also sort of using these so-called original cultures as a way to sort of market a particular kind of golden age Hinduism. But you're seeing a lot of those same folks form coalitions, which maybe wouldn't have happened before, with JNU student groups. And I saw this, I write a little bit about this in my work on West Bengal's tourism department and how they use Instagram, right? But how the Asur community there really actually ends up finding some interesting solidarities with JNU student protests, right? And that I don't know would have happened before, but we are seeing that. There's a question in the chat that's following up on this, if I may ask you both to weigh in. Following up on Usha's question, in opposing contemporary Hindutva, where do some of these oppositional groups fall on the spectrum of recuperating versus critiquing Hinduism per se? I think this is actually a great follow-up. Thank you so much. Rohit, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, it's a hard one, because there are people who will. So one argument is essentially that Hindutva is Hinduism in its purest form, right? And that is an argument that was made by some people at the conference, and that kind of set the Hindu right off. And even T.M. Krishna actually interestingly made that point. And then then there's the argument that Hindutva is part of the landscape of Hinduism, but it doesn't exhaust Hinduism. So we can still be part of Hinduism, but we still need to have, Hinduism still needs to go a long way. And then, I think where the two groups are probably united is that it's not just the Hindutva group, but it's people who espouse a liberal politics who may be, formally part of the left or not, but even if they're not, they're these professionals, they like to think of themselves as enlightened, they really need to examine their caste biases, and they don't. And I think the divide between the two groups is, one group thinks that it can be done, and the other group thinks that no, we just reject it in total, right? That we just have to form another kind of identity. So.
All right, those are all good points. Thomas?
No, I just want to say again, it's not an easy thing to sort of say anything very precise about, because it's so varied across the country. And of course, I mean, I have sympathy, and I think most people who think about this will say, yes, of course, Hindutva doesn't exhaust what there is in terms of Hindu practices. So I think there's a lot of merit to that. The question is, whether that should be a sort of, could there be a counter to the Hindutva strategy by actively cultivating a different kind of Hinduism, whether those many traditions that are not subsumed under these kinds of umbrellas, who do not necessarily subscribe to this kind of unitary formation of a Hinduism in danger, which is essentially the argument, right? We have to constantly be vigilant, otherwise they will take our cows away, or they will pollute this or that, or they will do whatever. Is that political project waiting there to be formulated? I don't know. I mean, Hinduism is not really, doesn't really lend itself very easily to those kinds of, Hindu practices don't lend themselves. And caste is, again, one of the big elephant in the room there, you know. So there are, of course, but these are smaller groups. I mean, you do see increasing conversions to Buddhism among Dalits also outside of the Western India. That is happening, but it's not happening on a massive scale. It's not at all. I think there's still a lot of also Dalits who see themselves as Hindus and see themselves as gaining in respectability and inclusion by being respected for what they actually are and what their ancestral tradition may be. And I can see a lot of merit to that argument too.
Can I just quickly add something, Dheepa? You know, so I published this book last year called The Gita for a Global World, Ethical Action in an Age of Flux. And I'm looking at the Gita, warts and all. And I had a number of talks related to it. And one of the talks at an institute, and I won't name it, in India, there was a young man, a student who was a Dalit, and he said that, he quoted Dr. Ambedkar that the Gita is a counter-revolutionary book. It's deeply conservative. And he said that, why did you write this book? Why are you trying to recuperate it? This book should be burnt. And, I thought that I have a chapter where I say that there is no way you can fit the arguments about caste or about gender roles in the Gita into a modern conception of rights. So here I was thinking that, I had been critical enough on caste where, some people told me, there is no casteism in the Gita. You're projecting casteism on the Gita. That was one perspective which came from, privileged caste Hindus. But here there was this Dalit young man who was saying that, you're not just are you sort of light on the caste question, but in a sense, that you are, you're part of the problem. And then I know there are other people who just said that at this moment in India, even writing a book like this, this project should not happen. So, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I'll add one last comment to both of these, which is that we see right now how the precarity of left politics or progressive politics in the US rests on a sort of very kind of a hodgepodge minority coalition that kind of votes with a certain group of people. And that's sort of where that democratic politics or machine comes from. And I think it's interesting because I think one of the more, at least terrifying to me personally, is the unified, I would say, at least the sense of community on the right that's not matched in any way, as far as I can tell. And that's partly because many of these groups actually, just like just like Rohit pointed out about this Dalit student, there are a number of different, let me call them causes that actually take precedence over this. Hindutva is a problem, but actually casteism is actually much worse. Or, right, and an understanding where your politics are going to be. I see Anna has her hand raised. Anna, can I invite you to ask a question?
Hi. I guess I'm just taking my own privilege here, so apologies for that. But so I'm thinking that back in the day, right, the BJP had this constant sort of three-pronged platform issues that were their big decisive wedge issues. The Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi issue, that's done right now. Building a temple, mission accomplished. Article 370, special status for Kashmir, revoked, constitution changed. Now that's changing. The other one was the Uniform Civil Code. And so going back to Usha's question about the status of women, which is often sort of construed as primarily affecting questions around marriage and divorce and so forth. Do you all see Uniform Civil Code questions as perhaps coming into this, becoming increasingly prominent? Of course, we've seen love jihad issues becoming very prominent, and other issues around the status of women, particularly Hindu women vis-a-vis Muslim men, but other things. Are we expecting the next big thing to be Uniform Civil Code related, or where do you see the next futurisms of the Hindu state, as Dheepa put it?
Promise?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Shabanu case was the driver in this whole, when they launched this whole critique of legal practice, right? And the whole question of Muslim of family law and so on. Will they have an all-out initiative on uniform civil code? Possibly. I mean, the main target has always been Muslims. It's not less Christians and less Sikhs and so on. It's possible, but I don't see that coming, because I think there is there are other maybe fish to fry, and I think they at the moment, and we'll see what happens in this upcoming election and all that. I think what they are really what's dawning on them is in some ways also the precarity of this sort of politics of high emotion that they have created, and this is the only way they can generate it. So the question of you can in the next anti-minority push uniform civil code, yes, but what will it do? Will it, what will also happen to Hindu communities in that process, and so on? Does it mean that the family laws for Hindus will also have to change, and so on and so forth, right? It's complicated. So it's not a ready-made thing. And I think what they are now is in some kind of mode of thinking of how to ramp up or keep the temperature high, because that's how they win elections. That's how they have won elections. They don't really have any major policy points. Many of their sort of hot button issues have been dealt with one way or the other. And in some ways, the defeat, the political and social defeat of Muslims is a big problem for the BJP, because it's how do you keep on generating this kind of awesome enemy that was much easier in the 90s? And that gets ever more difficult. So I think that's where they are. The Uniform Civil Code is a very, once you start thinking about what it might entail, is a very complicated sell, and it wouldn't necessarily play well in the street. I'm not sure about that.
Right?
Yeah, so I will first admit that I didn't see the temple coming. I didn't see 370 coming. People who were supporters of the BJP and, till I'd say even well into Modi's first term, they were like, this is just for the BJP's manifesto. It's never going to happen. The Uniform Civil Code, I think also the issue is that, Hindus will also lose certain rights, like with the joint family and so on. But I echo what Thomas says, because I think what they will do is they will keep harping on that love jihad question, because it's an imagined wound. Or an imaginary wound, which on the basis of which, anger can be generated almost infinitely. And, the idea of like, the sexuality of the Muslim man preying on the Hindu woman, and B, the idea of Hindu humiliation. Like what these fake narratives do is that, along with the figure of the Muslim invader, the anxiety about Hindu effeminacy is just constant, is absolutely constant. And here's the thing, if this wound is this imaginary wound, then it can never be healed. It can never be healed. So there's constant challenge that if you're a Hindu, do this. If you're a Hindu, do this, show this, show this, show this, take revenge for this. And I think my sense is that's what's going to be milled. Now, what to me is one thing that's sort of disturbing, and I know there were a couple of fantastic papers about this at Akanksha Mehta, and I think, I forget the name of one or two other people who talked about the women of the Hindu right. There's a certain category of, like a personality on Twitter who might have 500,000, 1 million followers. And these are women, and the virulence with which they advocate this notion of, our Hindu men must humiliate Muslim women is just frightening. I don't know how to begin to unpack it, actually. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
I mean, I would quickly tell you that one of the things I see most posted in the Facebook groups that I study on the Hindu right is the Uniform Civil Code. So I don't know, and a lot of my work looks at how that stuff translates into real policy. So I can't speak to the experience that both Rohit and Thomas have, but I do think it's really interesting, and I'll leave it at this, that you see it specifically not only with Muslims, right? And like, but we see it a lot as like a justification to end casteism, that like with the Uniform Civil Code, that somehow casteism is really related to, in their minds, not having a uniform civil code. And to that point, I think, at least I see a lot of emotion and excitement around this idea of ending reservations. So that reservations are really caste discrimination. That's the real caste discrimination. In fact, I've been following a thread about what they call the Poor Brahmin, like I think is his name, on and so there's a number of these now of people that are so poor and sad, they're Brahmins, but like they get nothing from that. And it really reminds me of what we see here with white working class, like that emotion of hurt, right? Like it's very similar. And I'm just curious, because it seems like partly what they're wanting is this, but I don't know enough about it as Thomas and Rohit, they're much more experienced, but I do see this kind of trend in these Facebook.
Yeah, if I just may, I mean, yes, of course, the Uniform Civil Code is there as a kind of sort of ideal, and it's a very empty demand in some ways, because the legal intricacies will be so many that I think it's a hard sell. Reservations, I think, is very interesting, and it may also have to do with the sort of, let's call, what did you say, the Gail Umbert's term, the Brahminical bias of the internet, right? And again, from what I have seen, perhaps a little more sort of, at least until a few years ago, a little more street level view, I find that it's a very strong sentiment, but I do think that they would have a really hard time. Their core constituency would buy into it, but I think it would be really hard for the BJP to win elections if they did away with that, because that is something that has a very deep hold on the political imagination of a lot of communities. It really has a kind of symbolic, although the real impact of reservation is, whatever studies have been done of it, is actually quite limited, right? Very limited, because most quotas never get filled and so on and so forth. So the problem is a bit like the love jihad problem. It's actually, to a large extent, an imaginary problem. It looms very large in the imagination of IIT graduates and others. But apart from that, you know, it doesn't really, but it has an emotional charge among these communities that may not avail themselves of reservations, but they could. And so that it becomes a symbol for a certain kind of inclusion into the nation. And I just don't see Amit Shah picking that one up and running with that in an election. I may be wrong, but I just don't see it. Because this is what it hinges on, right? That majority is a politically mobilized majority today in a way that it wasn't 30 or 40 years ago.
No, I think you're right. It's just interesting because when you map like what else has sort of transferred, like the Ram Janmabhoomi in from that space, and you see it. I am curious. Like I predict nothing, but I do.
I never predict anything.
I don't predict anything. But let me get to Usha has a follow-up that I would like to bring in, since we don't have any hands, unless anyone else, please do jump in. But it's in the chat related to my comment earlier, a broader question about the failure of secularism, not just in the Indian context, but even in its European avatar, church-state separation, where the affective apparatus of hurt has been galvanized across a range of constituencies, white supremacist organizations, liberal Europeans who are anti-migrant, centrist governments, etc. So rather than bemoan the fall of secularism, might it be generative to look to other formations? Rohit, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to draw here on the work of one of my teachers, Abdullahi Annaim at Emory University, who I was privileged to work as his research assistant, and I organized in grad school some workshops on a project which became his book, Islam, Sharia, and the Secular State. And I think he makes this point that, you know, the separation is you know, it's not this sort of hard and fast separation, and it takes a different trajectory in every society. And he has an interesting argument where he makes a conceptual distinction between secularism, he says, is not the separation of religion and politics, which is often used. He says, because you can't separate religion from politics, you know. Pastors will tell people how to vote. People will vote on the basis of, you know, how they feel about something the Pope says. But he says secularism should be understood as the separation of religion and state, right? And there's a distinction between the state as a kind of entity and politics, which stems from the government of the day. And he says that, you know, what he's calling for with regard to Islam and Sharia, and I'm not an expert on any of this, But he traces this in different countries. India is one of them, Indonesia. He looks at Nigeria also, and there are places where there have been Christian-Muslim tensions, Muslim-Hindu tensions, and so on. And he says that you essentially what you need to do is you need to it's exactly the opposite of what's happening in India. You need to not make any invocation of Sharia subject to charges of blasphemy, right? So the way to save Sharia is actually to marginalize it in a sense, because people will draw on it. People in the public imagination, Sharia is associated with hudud, the punishments, but Sharia actually is a larger sort of code which has advice on everything from shipping to banking to how to raise your children. But once you say that it's the word of God, opposing it essentially becomes an act of blasphemy. And he says, is this secularism? So he says, call it X. It's more than secularism and it's less than secularism. Now, to me, when I think of Professor Naim's work, it's interesting that what we see happening in India now, with especially the last 10 years, there is this creation of things being blasphemous that never were blasphemous earlier. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Usha on this one, that I think we shouldn't bemoan the fall of this particular regime of secularism, which was actually a form of, it was a sort of understood, as I said, on the ground. It was translated into a certain kind of performative code. How do public officials behave? How do politicians behave? In some ways, it's all spelled out and policed during, for instance, the rules of the Election Commission. And this is where you have cases where politicians are being punished for making anti-minority speeches and all that. I think the anxiety around a lot of this sort of earlier, this iteration of what secularism came to mean had to do with this sort of how to manage public sentiments and how not to create or increase the temperature of intercommunity enmity, right? And this is gone. This is over. I mean, this government runs on violating. The BJP runs on violating everything to do with that ethos. So that it's gone. So rather than bring it back in its sort of rather weak form, I agree. I think it's about thinking of other kinds of alliances that could be made. In fact, forms of you can say alliances between people who might identify as Hindu in a very broad sense, and other groups, and in a sense create a broader sense of what Hinduism may be about, or what in a sense expand this civilizational category of what might India contain, rather than making it into a sort of a battle between these entities, between Hindu and Muslim and so on. This is where the BJP has been running on. They're going to win that battle. I think one has to dissolve those categories, but that's a very hard sell. It's a very, very hard and long process. But I think the only alternative to this kind of secularism that constantly reified and worked on the idea of sort of slightly unified communities.
Those are all good points. One quick point I would make is that we're seeing also really interesting coalitions happening, especially in South India, in linguistic spaces, where we're seeing kind of linguistic nationalism that is also a kind of has its own sort of like fascist and ethno-nationalist framework that's coming out that is a response to Hindutva, but then is that so much better? I'm not so sure, you know what I mean?
It's majoritarianism of a different kind.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let me call on our last question. You have our distinction of being our last question today.
So thank you for this conversation. I'm thinking about, the affect of hurt is very tricky, and the idea that an imaginary wound can never heal. I'll keep thinking about that. But I'm wondering at the same time, I do see like something emerging, like a deep discontent with the state of the world, need to be seen, whatever you call it, among like Hindus in India, given like such a strong hold that such a violent movement has over such a large swath of the public. So I'm wondering what possibilities you see to begin to address any kind of deeper need, if there is one, or if that's even possible, without the violent turn of Hindutva.
Thank you for the question. Rohit, can I invite you to weigh in, and then Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that who's, when we say Hindu discontent, it again goes back to the question of who belongs under that category of Hindu and who is considered legitimately Hindu and who is not. I mean, if you look at every single day, the violence on Dalits, it's frightening. And Gyan Pandey has this statement, he calls it the remoteness of Delhi. If Delhi stands for this sort of model of the constitutional, secular, inclusive state, he says that, you go sort of 1 hour outside and you just see this sort of brutal casteist society in operation. Now, many of those Dalits identify as Hindu, but, is their pain given the same legitimacy as the pain of, someone who, feels that reservation is against meritocracy and I lost an IIT seat? And I don't want to trivialize anyone's pain. I don't want to trivialize, the challenges of everyday life. But to me, it's what Judith Butler calls grievable life, whose lives are grievable, whose pain counts. So I think, along with my father-in-law said something very nice to me once, and he said that, yes, we have, people of just capable of incredible barbarity. And there are these sort of abiding structures of ugliness in Indian society, but we also have, people with incredible compassion. And we have those traditions as well. I mean, you think of someone like Sudha Bhardwaj, you think of, the people who are fighting Modi right now. And maybe those traditions we took them for granted in a way. And that was, this Gandhian idea that there's this sort of harmony that lives underneath, and it's sort of existed before and through the colonial period and afterwards. But it's something that needs to be cultivated. So, it's going to take, what kind of effort it's going to take is not for me to say, but perhaps, we need to look at those resources.
Thomas?
Yeah. The feelings of hurt is a very complicated thing, right? I mean, I think there's one feeling of hurt that's been cultivated and is experienced very keenly in the diaspora, which is the feeling of being marginal and non-recognized and so on. And a lot of those people in the online spaces also come from those and live that, right? And that's something that's experienced in the supermarket, in the workplace, and in general public culture in this country and Canada and elsewhere, right? So being a minority, but feeling like a majority back home. So I think that's one discrepancy that's experienced very keenly. The other one is, we shouldn't forget this, if I may zoom out, do a little sort of macro view of things, that when does Hindutva rise to become powerful? It comes to be powerful, it coincides with the unprecedented rise of lower caste assertion across India in the 80s and 90s. And also unprecedented levels of new forms of social mobility or possibilities among some Muslim communities who went to the Gulf, for instance, and began to have, and it's very strong in Kerala and parts of Western UP and Maharashtra and Gujarat and so on. So what you have is a sort of what is being lost? What is the Hindu hurt? The Hindu hurt, I think, is to some extent the sort of magnification and the way in which discourse of reservation, and it became a sort of this is essentially what I argued in a book many years ago, the sort of anti-political sentiment, the sort of reaction against, oh, this damn democracy. You know, that if you ask many people in India, lots of people will say democracy is a terrible idea, but this is what we have, right? So it's very low approval of democracy in India. And I think it has to do with the fact that what is the loss? It's a symbolic loss. It's an imaginary loss of the self-evidence of our dominance. And that's experienced very keenly also among dominant castes across Indian villages, where the dominant castes no longer have an effortless grip on the rural poor, because they go to the cities and join construction crews, or do other things, or they do Enrega or other schemes, right? So so caste violence also follows. So I think we have to look at the sort of what is the character of the hurt? What's the character of and it's not necessarily an individualized hurt, but it's a feeling of people like us, the proper people, that we don't enjoy the same respect or self-evident dominance in the world anymore. So in many ways, Hindutva is channeling all these emotions, and it's certainly also channeling this sort of casteist emotion that's being released in all kinds of ugly ways. And that, I think, is what we need to think about, that the hurt, it's real, but it's structural in some very large way, and it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is, except that those people shouldn't be so loud, and those people shouldn't get elected to office, and those people shouldn't represent my community, and so on and so forth, right? That's how people talk, and that's a sign of rapid change, but also a sign of a world that's getting less natural, a sort of caste hierarchical world that's actually being challenged every day, and that's the hurt, I think.
There are other ways we're seeing this challenged as well. I mean, both these points were excellent. And I would say, like, the new film that's going to be coming out, I think it was Oscar nominated, Writing with Fire. My friend Yashika Dutt's review of this was fabulous, because she pointed out, rather than sort of centering the hurt, right? Like, you hear a lot of the woe is me reviews of poor these women. She was like, these women were just badass. They were powerful. They were some of the best journalists I've ever seen. And why can't we talk about them as journalists? And so we are seeing empowering frameworks and narratives, again, coming out of the DBA community. And I'll end with this, but I'm also reminded of a panel I listened to at this Counting Caste conference recently, where P. Ranjit, who's just a really amazing documentary filmmaker in the Tamil scene, said, once I would just like to be known as a documentary filmmaker who makes powerful movies for the marginalized, not a Dalit documentary filmmaker. So sometimes I think we're seeing models in which the hurt is actually converted into a different kind of agency. And I think the models are not coming from left-leaning Hindus, they're coming from these other communities. But thank you, great question.
Absolutely.
I think that's all the time we have, right? Is that right?
Yep. Thank you, everybody. I wish that we could keep talking, because I feel like there's so much here. So we'll have to continue the conversation in some way. Thank you so much to Dheepa, to Thomas, to Rohit, to the whole team, and to everybody who tuned in. Really much appreciated for your presence, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.